Welcome into Words with Wallace. I'm your host, Nick Wallace, coming at you. It is Sunday, July 14th. What is up, everybody? Been a minute since the last podcast. Not going to lie to you. Had my first case of technical issues, we will say, because I meant to get this podcast out probably about almost a full week ago at this point, and recorded the entire podcast, start to finish, all about free agency, all the biggest news and updates. What happens? I actually have this microphone right here on mute for the entirety of the podcast. So didn't even realize it until I went to export the clip, and then I just see the video of me just moving my mouth, just yapping up a storm, just no audio whatsoever. And that pissed me off. That was a tough one to swallow. Really just didn't have the heart to just go back and record the same exact podcast like the next day or whatever. So took some time to mentally recover from that incident, and here we are. So I was kind of due for that when you think about it. Like, I've been doing this pod for like over a year and a half now. So the fact that this is the first time I had to re-record an episode from start to finish is kind of surprising, to be honest with you, for someone as dumb as myself, just trying out this podcasting thing. But regardless, here we are, man. I really picked a tough week to miss. I was hoping I could at least get some big time news that breaks between when I actually recorded this podcast and now. But that being said, not much has happened. There was one major contract extension that took place yesterday that we will talk about when we cover that specific team. But as you guys can tell by the title of the episode, we are going to be talking about the winners and the losers of the NBA offseason. Originally, I was going to focus on just free agency, but frankly, if a team approved, whether it be through the draft or through trade or through free agency, it doesn't really matter, right? It's just one of those things where what teams are better and better positioned to ultimately win a championship heading into next year than they were this previous season. So we're going to talk all about basically the top 5 winners and the top 5 losers, in my opinion. Of course, we will be ranking those teams in order, and that will be the meat and potatoes of this episode. But before we get into that, I did just want to cover, of course, Team USA had their first exhibition game for the Olympics the other day against Team Canada. That was actually a really interesting game. I mean, I don't want to go through and tell you exactly what happened. The team started terribly, but ultimately, I think Anthony Edwards and Jason Tatum, at least at the beginning of the game, provided a pretty solid spark off the bench, and then Ant was honestly our best player throughout. He was really good in the second half as well. And ultimately, Team USA beat Canada, who a lot of people would say is probably the next best team in the Olympics, which is hilarious because they have an entire roster of only NBA players. But regardless, it was cool to see Team USA win. I'm really excited to watch them. But there was some drama on the front of Team USA that I want to cover. And it is announced as of basically a week ago at this point that Kawhi Leonard, who was originally penciled in for one of the roster spots for Team USA, is actually not going to be playing with Team USA. Some people think it's just because of injury. Some people think like he's already hurt. Some people think it's because of the recovery from the last injury. You know, some people think the Clippers like put their foot down and was like, we really just don't want to see you playing in this Olympics because of your injury history or whatever. Regardless, Kawhi was originally at camp. He was there for a few days and now he's out. So it was announced that the replacement for Kawhi Leonard was Derek White. Now, a third member of the Boston Celtics joining Jason Tatum and Drew Holiday on the team is Derek White. I'm super happy for Derek White. The flip side of that coin is that Jaylen Brown is pretty pissed off, right? He's definitely, in my opinion, the best American player who is not on Team USA. It's kind of funny that we have a guy like Embiid taking one of those spots and some other players that I just think are straight up worse than Jaylen Brown, like Tyrese Halliburton is on the team as well. But of course, Jaylen didn't get the nod, and he had some subtweets as if it was like 2012 up in here, basically tweeting like the thinking emoji when he didn't make the team, and then he deflected his anger toward Nike, and he tweeted at Nike. Obviously, they're the uniform sponsor of Team USA, and was like, "Why are we doing this?" Right? And so that sucks. And first of all, I do understand it from Jaylen Brown's perspective, right? He is, at the worst, his second best player on his own team. Two of his teammates that are not overall as talented as Jaylen Brown are on the team. And obviously some other players like we talked about. The dude is an American player who just won Eastern Conference MVP, his first championship, and subsequently the finals MVP as well. Like, he has a real reason to be upset he's not on the team. It just sucks that he's voicing his displeasure at the same time of one of his guys, his teammates, Derek White, makes a team. So you could basically spin it like Jaylen Brown is pissed that Derek White made Team USA, right? Like, that's, if you really wanted to spin zone Jaylen, that's how it could go. I'm kind of glad he deflected the blame at Nike. He's had some weird tweets about Nike in the past and some of the skeletons in Nike's closet, so I thought that was pretty interesting. So I see it from both sides. Now, I do want to defend Team USA a little bit because I honestly do think that Derek White is probably a better fit for the team, right? Like, when you have players of the caliber of, LeBron James and Steph Curry and Kevin Durant and Jason Tatum and Anthony Edwards. Like, you don't need like another on-ball creator, superstar, right? A guy that's really dynamic with the ball in his hands. Like, you need guys like Drew Holiday and Derek White who just defend their ass off, can play off the ball, can sit in the corner, can move in space, all that stuff. Like, all those things are attributes that both Derek White and Drew Holiday do better than Jaylen Brown. And so I do get it from the team building perspective. And also the fact that this team is absolutely loaded. Like, I'm not going to go through the entire Team USA roster. As expected, this is potentially the best Olympic team that the country has ever fielded. And then when you include the fact that, not all 12 guys should be playing if you're really trying to win if these games get sticky, right? You kind of need 2 guys at the end of the roster that aren't going to play a ton. I would hope and expect that at least one of those guys is Tyrese Halliburton. And I'd, at this point, especially with the late addition to the team, expect the other guy in that spot is going to be Derek White, who might not play as much. And then there's some questions about how comfortable would Jaylen Brown be if he was on the team and then not playing as much. So just a little bit of drama for you. And I think there was just one final piece on this. It was really funny. It was some jerk reporter at Team USA asked Jason Tatum, who's of course in the middle of all this, right? His other teammate gets the spot, but Jaylen didn't get the spot. He's also sponsored by Jordan and Nike and all this stuff. And they're asking Tatum, hey, do you miss having Jaylen Brown here? Do you wish he was here right now? And Tatum, he's and you see, his eyes, darting around. And obviously, Tatum's been, flawlessly media trained. He never really says anything exciting. And he just kind of danced around the question. He obviously didn't give a right answer. But the panic on his face when, somebody asked Tatum in this situation what he thinks about Jaylen Brown not being there, it's just a cruel question. There's no right answer to it. So I thought that was pretty funny as well. But without further ado, let's start getting into the winners and the losers of the NBA offseason. I will obviously talk more about Team USA if anything eventful happens with the team, but I do kind of expect them to run through the group that they're in, and maybe we'll cover the team a little bit more as the summer develops and we're looking for things to talk about. But anyways, winners and losers of the NBA offseason. Let's start off with the winners. Let's start off positive, right? And before we get into the top 5, I did have a couple honorable mentions for the winners, at least. I think there were a lot of teams that you can make the argument tangibly improved since the conclusion of last season. And tentatively, I'm putting the Kings as a winner, right? Which is, a lot of people would probably disagree with. So I don't feel super strongly about it. That's why they're an honorable mention. But let's talk about the Sacramento Kings, because let's just go through all of their moves. They re-signed both Alex Len and Malik Monk. And the big news is that they were a part of a trade, a sign and trade, if you will, that brought in DeMar DeRozan into the building. And so let's go through the details of that trade first. In that deal, the Kings received DeMar DeRozan, the Spurs received Harrison Barnes, and the Bulls received Chris Duarte and a couple second-round picks. However, it was also noted kind of after the trade came out, which was pretty interesting, that along with Harrison Barnes, the Spurs also received a 2031 pick swap with the Sacramento Kings. So ultimately, the Kings had to give up Chris Duarte, Harrison Barnes, and then a 2031 pick swap, along with the cap space it took to sign DeMar DeRozan. So I thought that was pretty interesting. DeRozan's contract itself is actually on a pretty team-friendly deal. But the question is, if you're the Kings, does getting better to the point, first of all, did you get better from that deal? And was it worth the assets that you gave up to basically sign a free agent, right? There is a world in which they just outright signed DeMar DeRozan, but to make the salary cap work a little bit better and to get rid of Harrison Barnes' contract, they had to throw in some extra assets, right? And to answer the first question about if they got better, I think the answer is yes, right? I think tangibly, offensively, you get a guy in DeMar DeRozan. We know very much who he is at this point. He's not going to shoot the 3 ball at the highest clip, but he's a fantastic isolation player. He's really dynamic, creating shots for himself, especially at the end of games. At the end of games, it's going to be terrifying worrying about 2 of the most clutch players in the league, in De'Aaron Fox and now DeMar DeRozan as well. The issue is just that, they already were a pretty abysmal defensive team, and you probably get worse with this move here, and a little bit smaller as well, going from Harrison Barnes to DeMar DeRozan. And so if you're the Kings, why are you so willing to trade a 2031 pick swap when the history of the franchise would tell you they're going to be terrible in 2031? Because more or less that's what they've been over the past couple decades, right? And I just think you have to remember that not every team is going to contend for a championship. Not every team has championship aspirations. We would love it to be that way, but the odds that you're, the one of the 30 teams that ends up holding the trophy at the end of the year are really slim. And when you have as terrible of playoff success as the Kings have had over the past couple decades, they're just trying to be in the mix. It was such a huge accomplishment for this Kings team to even make the playoffs the year before last, in which they got their hearts broken by Steph Curry and the Golden State Warriors in 7 games. That was the best season in Kings history over the past 20 years, right? The Timberwolves and their playoff drought kind of distracted folks from just how long it had been for the Kings as well. And they're still chasing a series win. And so when you're a fan base that has been deprived of talent, like it's okay to just try to get better, to just be better than what you were the year before. And they're still going to face an uphill climb. And I don't necessarily love the fit around Fox and Sabonis and now DeMar DeRozan in the mix, but I think they got better. I think they're trying. I think it's okay that they're, sacrificing maybe some long-term potential to actually win a playoff series win. And let's be real, like it's just a loaded Western Conference, and like they're not going to rebuild down to the studs when you have two guys that are really good in Fox and Sabonis. I just don't think either of them are great, and you're in a tough spot if you're trying to win a championship with any of those guys as your best players. So they're not championship contenders, but I don't think they should be clowned for trying to go out there and make themselves a better team than what they were the year before. I like DeMar DeRozan. I think he's a really good player. Kind of a hometown guy, I guess. I mean, I guess LA and Sacramento aren't all that close, but he is a California guy, so that's cool for him. So anyways, I'm pretty neutral on the DeMar DeRozan trade. I think the Kings are tangibly better than what they were last year, so I consider it a win. And obviously they did add some other guys as well. They also traded for Jalen McDaniels. They signed Jordan McLaughlin, and then they ultimately lost Harrison Barnes, Chris Duarte, like we talked about, and they traded away Davion Mitchell as well as part of the deal they did on the draft night. So that was kind of the Kings offseason in a nutshell. And it is just worth noting that I think the real winners of that DeMar DeRozan transaction are the San Antonio Spurs, which, spoiler alert, we're going to talk more about in a little bit. But basically, they had to pay the Spurs to take on Harrison Barnes' contract because he's making $37 million over the next 2 seasons. So let's keep it pushing. The next honorable mention team, the Milwaukee Bucks, this one will be a lot shorter. They just added Taurean Prince on a 1-year deal as well as DeLon Wright. They only lost Malik Beasley as well, and I just think for a Bucks team that's basically handicapped with the moves they can make, like their big swing was obviously getting Dame last offseason, like they're pigeonholed into the roster that they have. But as far as work around the fringes to get two guys that I think like Taurean Prince is much better than whatever you got from Jay Crowder last year and can shoot the ball at a much higher clip. DeLon Wright has been a really good defensive guard for like a couple pretty good teams now. It's just kind of interesting that he keeps bouncing around, but like I think that's an upgrade over like the Patrick Beverley spot. I wouldn't even be surprised if DeLon Wright starts for the Bucks at some point. So I just really like those moves for a team that's basically working around the fringes. The next honorable mention team, we have the Magic. They re-signed Goga Biotish. They re-signed Gary Harris, re-signed Jonathan Isaac, and re-signed both Wagner brothers, Franz and Mo, that is. And their big addition was acquiring KCP in free agency, which we are going to talk more about. But they signed KCP to a 3-year, $66 million deal. I think they would have been better off getting a traditional point guard of some stretch and like pushing Suggs to more of like the 2-guard off-guard spot. But their defensive backcourt is pretty nasty now because KCP is, while he's not the same defender he was a couple years ago, like he's still really good, and Suggs is going to get the primary assignment of whoever the other team's best on-ball creator is. So when you think about KCP guarding like your second best guard and still shooting the ball at a really good clip, like besides like the need for a point guard, like they just needed outside shooting really desperately in Orlando, and I think they got that in KCP. And then also, I thought the Isaac extension was really good value to get Isaac for 5 years, $84 million. Obviously, he's had a really long injury history, but when he's out there, he's like insane defensively and can do stuff at the wing or even the center position like we saw in the playoffs last year. The Franz extension was huge, 5 years, $224 million. That's kind of like the max extension. It could get up to like 270, I believe, if he actually makes like an All-NBA team, which I'm not holding my breath on as much as I like Franz. But that's just kind of the price it costs to retain guys. So don't mind those moves for the Magic. And then the final honorable mention team, I have to shout out my Celtics, right? What did my Celtics do, you ask? They re-signed everybody, which was awesome. They re-signed Cornette on a 1-year deal. They re-signed Keita on a multi-year deal. They re-signed Jason Tatum to a 5-year max extension for $314 million. That he could have had 315, I guess, so maybe it's not the max. It was announced he took 314 because that's his area code from St. Louis. Must say, as a Celtics fan, man, if St. Louis ever got an expansion team, like we're so cooked. Like Tatum is out of here. Like he likes Boston. He's cool being there, but we are just very lucky St. Louis doesn't have a team because he would be out of there in a hurry. Xavier Tillman returned on a 2-year, $5 million contract. Love that value for Tillman. And then Derek White was re-signed to a 4-year, $125 million deal, which I believe was the max he was eligible for, but he's worth every penny. So what does this mean for the Celtics? It means that they're really well positioned to obviously defend the title. They didn't lose a single person, and also they picked up Sam Hauser's option as well. So they lost literally nobody. They re-signed all of their core guys and their role players for at least next season. And all of our like big 5 guys are re-signed beyond next year as well. Like we have Kristaps for at least an extra year for the following season, and then obviously Tatum, Brown, White, and Holiday are all locked up beyond that as well. So that's really great. The downside, and I will just talk about it now, I guess, is that the Celtics, it's announced that they're selling the team, or at least Wyc Grousbeck, majority owner of the team, is going to be selling his portion of the team. It is announced that Steve Paliuca, who is like currently a minority owner of the Celtics, is the leader in the clubhouse to become the eventual majority owner of the team, which would be great. Because I think overall, the fact that the Celtics are for sale in some capacity is bad news, just because we haven't really noticed Wick. He's let Brad cook and Missoula coach and all that stuff. Like, he's just been in the background, paying the luxury tax, doing whatever he has to do to help his team win. Like, that's all you can ask from an owner. No scandals, no controversy, whatever. And the fact that this is clearly going to be a second apron team with how insane our payroll is, it's a little concerning. Like, there is a world in which the sale happens, and then it wouldn't happen for, like, I believe a couple years at least for how long this process takes. So I guess there's no immediate worry, but eventually we could get to the point where we're still really competitive 2-3 years from now. The team is for sale and the new owner doesn't want to pay the luxury tax, doesn't want to be at the second apron, whatever. And ultimately everything falls apart. Now, if it's Paliuka, the guy that's already in the building, a Celtics fan just like Wick, you would assume he manages the same way that Wick did over his tenure as owner. And that would be best case scenario, but who knows, man. I'm not super well versed in the billionaire talk here. It's going to be a long process. It's just, it sucks to see an owner that we really like leave and potentially sell the team. But that being said, it makes sense. Like, the team just won. They have more titles than anybody else ever. They're officially the best franchise in sports if you're looking at championships, and I would certainly agree with that sentiment. And then, everything is just going up and up and up, and his investment has, probably 100x since the time he bought the team, like, many years ago. So from a business standpoint, it just makes sense to sell now. And now, finally, I'm sorry for that tangent there. I did just want to give my 2 cents on the Celtics re-signing everybody. You have to give them credit. It's the best team in basketball to maintain that cast. They didn't go the direction of the 2011 Mavericks and tear it down to the studs right after they won. So that's great. Next, let's talk about the actual top 5 winners of the offseason in order. At number 5, I have the Dallas Mavericks. Let's just run through all of their moves real quick as far as additions and departures. They actually didn't re-sign anybody yet at the time of this podcast, but they did add Quentin Grimes in the deal that we talked about on a previous podcast. They acquired him from the Pistons. They signed Najee Marshall from the New Orleans Pelicans on a 3-year, $27 million contract. And the big addition was, of course, signing Klay Thompson to a 3-year, $50 million contract. Technically, it was like a sign and trade with the Warriors. They did lose Josh Green as part of that sign and trade. He's now with the Hornets. And of course, they did lose Tim Hardaway Jr. as a part of the Grimes deal. And ultimately, they lost Derrick Jones Jr. in free agency to sign with the Clippers. Let's talk about Klay first, because that's the main addition. I mean, 3 years, $50 million for Klay is such a steal. Like, I know that Klay is a reduced version of himself, and he definitely hurt that Warriors team with just kind of him battling with himself, right? Like, taking a lot of shots that were out of his character, as he clearly wasn't the same guy he was, and he was trying to shoot himself back into rhythm a lot of the times with the Warriors last year. Certainly can't defend at the same level that he did in the past, but, like, he's still Klay Thompson. He's still, like, the second best shooter ever, and he's still extremely dynamic, especially being off the ball, moving without the ball. Like, he's going to get so many open looks with Luka and Kyrie as the primary ball handlers on this team. Like, it's going to be hard to guard. Like, and of course, like, Klay, he could have gone to the Lakers. He could have re-signed with Golden State. And I kind of thought he was going to go to the Lakers, but he ultimately went to the Mavericks, which definitely gives him the best chance out of the interested teams that could win a title that wanted Klay. Like, he went with the best option to try to contend. So we're going to get this revenge Klay narrative. We'll see how that goes. But, like, the only thing is that they're definitely worse defensively with Klay in the lineup as compared to, like, Derrick Jones, assuming he takes that spot, right? Because he just can't really guard anybody anymore. So between Luka, Kyrie, and Klay, like, who's guarding the team's best perimeter defender? Like, at that point, maybe you're plugging in Najee Marshall at the 4 and then kind of hoping that he is the guy that guards the perimeter defenders, while Luka can maybe guard, like, the other team's, like, power forward just because he's so damn big. And so that's, like, kind of one way to look at the lineup. And then either way, it is going to get a little tricky with Kyrie, Luka, Klay defensively with the version of Klay that we're getting, but he's still a dog. And I think it's a really no-brainer signing for the Mavericks, especially at, like, $17 million a year. Like, that's nothing for Klay Thompson. So, and of course, a guy that's won 4 championships, that goes without saying, the value in that. And then the Najee Marshall signing versus Derrick Jones, like, it is just kind of funny that Najee got 3 years, 27, and Derrick Jones got 3 years, 30 with the Clippers. So presumably, like, they could have just kept Derrick Jones Jr. instead, which I think people like Najee Marshall. He's a little bit bigger than Derrick Jones. He's probably a bit better offensively, but defensively, I don't think he can guard smaller players the same way that Derrick Jones proved he was able to do during the playoffs. And, like, his work on, Shea got his buckets, whatever, but he did pretty good job on Anthony Edwards. He was, formidable against Jason Tatum in the playoffs as well. Like, that type of versatility and already having that guy in the building for a deep playoff run, I feel like you lean Derrick Jones there, but whatever. I could be wrong. Najee Marshall's pretty good. I can't say I watched a ton of him on the Pelicans just because there are so many wings there, but a lot of people really like Najee Marshall as well. So I definitely think net the Mavericks got better, especially when you include, like, Grimes, like a defensive guard in the mix. Like, you get rid of that bum Tim Hardaway. Like, you have a really dynamic shooter in Clay, and then you replace Derek Jones with Najee Marshall, like the team is going to be very good and in a better position, I think, to win next year. It's just a matter of if the matchups go in favor of the Mavericks like they did in this past postseason run. Number 4 on the list of winners of the offseason, the San Antonio Spurs. I love what the Spurs did this offseason. Their only 2 additions are Harrison Barnes, like we talked about before, as well as Chris Paul. But that Chris Paul move is my favorite move of the entire offseason, my favorite individual transaction. 1 year, $11 million for Chris Paul after he was waived by the Warriors. Like, that is exactly what this Spurs team needs. Everybody's been yelling from the rooftops, get Wemby a point guard, get Wemby a point guard. And who do they get? They get the point guard, like the last old school, like cut from that type of cloth point guard in the NBA. And Chris Paul, I know he's like ancient now, like he's going to be turning 40, I think, but whatever. Like Chris Paul is a dog, and it's a really cool career move for Chris Paul too. Like, you know, he technically was traded for by the Golden State Warriors last year, but people were still like pointing at Chris Paul and saying he was ring chasing by joining Golden State, which would make sense that Chris Paul wants to win an NBA championship with the career that he's had. Like, that's one of the few boxes he needs to check. But instead of like signing with another super competitive team that has a chance to win the title, he's like, nah, I'm going to build my legacy or continue to build my, the twilight of my career by playing alongside the best prospect we've ever seen, like a guy with literal generational talent in Wembanyama, and really just work on developing this guy and being a part of a really young and fun team that could definitely now be in the playoff mix. Like, I'm really not gassing it by saying the Spurs could be in the playoffs with presumably how much better Wemby develops, adding Castle to the mix, who they also picked up through the draft, and then this signing of Chris Paul. Like, that is going to be incredible to watch, Chris Paul and Wembanyama. And Chris Paul presumably is going to be a starter again. He's not going to be coming off the bench like he was from Golden State. So expect to see a much more jubilant version of Chris Paul than what we saw last year. I think he's going to be a lot more fun to watch with the Spurs. So I'm all in on that move. I also kind of like the idea of getting Harrison Barnes and being rewarded with a 2031 pick swap to pick up the last 2 years of Barnes' contract, which he's basically at $17 million for the next 2 years. So way overpriced for Harrison Barnes. But like, look, if there's a team that needs another veteran that's won a championship and can, play his role and just do the right things, it's the Spurs. Like, they have room on the roster for Harrison Barnes, where it's not like he's just not going to play. I'd be pretty surprised if he didn't. So like that addition as well. The only departure that they lost was, of course, Devontae Graham in a trade with the Hornets. Now, let's talk about the number 3 team on this list, one of the biggest winners of the offseason, the New York Knicks. Just to recap the Knicks offseason so far, they re-signed OG Anunoby on a 5-year max extension, and it was just announced yesterday. This is really the only piece of news that's come out since I had to re-record this podcast, was Jalen Brunson on a 4-year, $157 million contract. A lot of money for Jalen Brunson, much deserved. But the reason this is kind of like a controversial move for Brunson is that he left $113 million on the table if Brunson had waited and signed a max extension at this time next year. So why did Brunson do that? Why did he leave $113 million on the table? There's a few different reasons. The first reason is the risk of injury / assumption that the Knicks are going to want to offer him this deal a year from now, right? He's playing under Tom Thibodeau, and he's a small guard who just got hurt. I know it was literally the second half of the last game of a game that was probably already over, but Brunson did get hurt in that final game in a pretty significant way. I think he broke his hand or something like that against the Pacers in Game 7. And you just got to assume that playing 40-something minutes a game, playing really physical, hitting the deck as a small guard in the NBA, there's a real injury risk. And that's probably the only way that the Knicks suddenly wouldn't want to offer Brunson a max contract, is if he was hurt at this time next year. But he's probably getting that money either way. We know how good Jalen Brunson is at this point. So that is kind of the main risk, is that, he gets hurt or has a career-ending injury or something crazy like that and leaves a ton of money on the table for not taking this contract. Also, and what people are saying is the main reason he decided to sign this contract now, is it keeps the Knicks out of the dreaded second apron with the annual savings that they're going to have. And so they have a lot more roster flexibility. They can afford to pay everybody on their team. They can still be below the second apron, so they have a lot more flexibility with their roster. And it's kind of like Jalen saying thank you, right, for going out and getting Mikal Bridges, for having this Nova Knicks, all of his boys on the team. He knows the Knicks are legitimate contenders, and so to give them the flexibility that they need, to not have to just work around the fringes for the next couple off seasons because Brunson got his bag, that's pretty notable. And then of course the final reason you take this contract now is that you get to hit free agency at least 1 year sooner, maybe 2 years sooner if he declines the player option for that last year of that extension. And the cap's only going up allegedly, right? So he could be entitled for even more money next time he hits free agency, and he gets to hit that and that free agency 1 year sooner by doing this. So overall, it's still an insane move. Like, he did leave in all likelihood $113 million on the table for at least like the next 4 years, which is insane. What else is insane is that the real winner of this deal, the real winner of the New York Knicks, is OG Anunoby. Make no mistakes about it. He signed a 5-year, $212 million extension. And it is likely that he is the fourth best player on the team, at least offensively. Overall, you could make the argument he's higher than that. But I would be surprised if he's anything but the fourth option at best on offense, behind Brunson and Randall and Bridges now. And he's making 5 years, $212 million. He is the highest paid player on the New York Knicks. It's hilarious that he signed the same offseason as Brunson. And Brunson was the one who's easily the best player on the team, like a real MVP candidate. He's the one taking the pay cut. So that is if anybody's a winner on the New York Knicks, it's OG Anunoby. He gets out of Toronto, gets to go to the Garden, play for a contending team, and didn't sacrifice a dollar to do that. And he's had real injury concerns as well. So OG is big up this offseason for sure. And it's also just kind of crazy to think hey, 2 years ago, people thought it was insane when the Knicks signed Jalen Brunson to a 3-year, $104 million contract. 3 years, 104, to some people was looked at as a really bad investment, a really risky move for the Knicks. And here he is, people are doing dancing in the streets of New York because he signed for 4 years, 157 as the extension. And he deserves it, right? It all makes sense. So if you're Knicks fans, you absolutely love it. You're so happy. Right when you think Brunson can't get any cooler in the city, it's even better now. People are going to love him for this move, and they should. The reason that they're number 3 on the list and not higher is, first of all, I think there's 2 teams we still need to talk about that got a lot better. But there were some losses for the Knicks that we need to talk about. They did lose Bogdanovich as part of that deal that brought in Mikal Bridges. They did lose Alec Burks as well. They lost Hartenstein, who we're going to talk more about. They also lost Shake Milton. But Hartenstein is the real loss here. He ends up signing with the Thunder, who we're going to talk more about in a second. But that is a big-time loss for the Knicks because now you're really depending on Mitchell Robinson, who really has not been able to stay healthy throughout his career as your defensive anchor. He is good enough to be your defensive anchor, but he's a worse product offensively than what Hartenstein does. And I don't know, man. I just think when the Knicks were really rolling last year, Hartenstein was a huge part of it. We'll talk more about how that deal for Hartenstein to sign with the Thunder really took place, but that's a big loss. You're depending on an injury-prone backup center and Mitchell Robinson to now be your guy. And they also, Precious, I believe, is still one of, the last remaining free agents that hasn't signed with the team. Especially with Brunson taking this pay cut, I'd be shocked if Precious ends up with another team besides New York Knicks. They should definitely bring in Precious to be their backup center and presumably starting center for many points of the season, just like he was. He held it down when the Knicks were really banged up late in the season. And so I think Precious is pretty solid and can easily be that backup center. But they need to get him. They need to ink him, because if he signs with somebody else, I don't really think there's any other obvious options for centers that are still available. The list of remaining free agents is very slim as we sit here and record on July 14th. The second biggest winner of the NBA offseason so far, is the Oklahoma City Thunder. They re-signed Isaiah Joe, they re-signed Isaiah Wiggins, but the big additions for the team were Alex Caruso, that we talked about in the last podcast, that 1-for-1 deal that he was swapped with the Chicago Bulls for Josh Giddey. And then they also added Isaiah Hartenstein, like we just talked about. Hartenstein's deal was a 3-year, $87 million contract. The reason it was pretty interesting that he left the Knicks is, by all accounts, he wanted to stay with the Knicks. The issue is that with the way the new CBA is structured, the Knicks could only pay Hartenstein for a 4-year deal. They could only pay him about $74 million. So $10 to $12 million less than what the Thunder paid, and one more year tacked on that deal. So Hartenstein's making more money in less time to sign with the Thunder and still gets to compete for a championship, presumably with the Oklahoma City Thunder. So that is just a massive addition for the Thunder team, right? I talked about on the last podcast, as much as I like the Caruso trade and that swap from Giddey to Caruso makes the Thunder better for next year, the biggest hole in this team and the biggest weakness with the team is that they can't rebound the basketball. They don't have a traditional center option to turn to. They have Chet Holmgren, but that's a lot to ask of him to go through the Western Conference and go through guys like Jokic and all the size that Minnesota has with Gobert and Towns. And now they get Hartenstein. That's a guy that literally filled that role for a Knicks team last year. That is a massive signing for the Oklahoma City Thunder. It is a lot of money to pay for Isaiah Hartenstein. 3 years, $87 million. It's not a small price tag for a guy that has a relatively short sample size of being really productive in the NBA. But for what the Thunder need him to do, it's pretty safe that he's going to be able to fill that role. And I think just with how good the Thunder already were, they clearly strengthened their team without losing anybody relevant, because again, it just wasn't going to be a fit long-term with Josh Giddey at this point. The Knicks got a lot better too, but they still have a big loss in Hartenstein. Whereas, the Thunder, it's only looking up for them. And maybe they're even the team to beat out of the West with some of the moves that took place this offseason. But of course, the biggest winner of the NBA offseason so far is the Philadelphia 76ers, and it's not all that close. Let's just read the list of all of their transactions in the offseason because it's a bunch, right? They re-signed Kyle Lowry on a 1-year contract. They re-signed KJ Martin on a 2-year contract. They re-signed Tyrese Maxey on a 5-year max extension. So that's really big news for the Sixers right there. They also re-signed Kelly Oubre on a 2-year team-friendly deal, which is awesome because Oubre was actually really productive for the Sixers last year. They also added, in free agency, Andre Drummond to a 2-year deal. So they finally have a backup big option behind Embiid that they trust a little bit more with more size than Paul Reed, which I think is a huge upgrade. They signed Eric Gordon to a 2-year contract. But the big additions were, of course, Paul George, 4-year, $212 million contract with the Philadelphia 76ers. And to boot, they also signed Caleb Martin to a 4-year, $32 million contract, snagging him from the Miami Heat. They did have some departures, right? They lost Nick Batum to free agency. They lost Mo Bamba to free agency. They lost Buddy Hield. They lost Paul Reed. And they lost DeAnthony Melton. But overall, this Sixers team got so much better, dude. And it all starts with Paul George, right? 4 years, $212 million from Paul George. I think this story is actually more about the Clippers fumbling this. And spoiler alert, we are going to talk about this move from the Clippers perspective coming up in a little bit. But just, it's a no-brainer if you're the Philadelphia 76ers. I know Paul George is a bit older. I know he has a checkered history in the playoffs at this point. But he's literally now your third option. You have Paul George as your third option, and it builds like a big three, so to speak, with Maxey and Embiid, where Paul George makes perfect sense in the middle of those guys. Like, he's plugging into the Tobias Harris spot. He's better than Tobias Harris, point blank, period. And it does make Philly a contender, at least on paper. As a Celtics fan, I don't fear the Paul George edition that much. The Caleb Martin edition, that one has me a little bit more nervous with the Celtics' history against Caleb Martin in the playoffs. That being said, overall, it's just a no-brainer for them to get, like, they go out and they just sign Paul George. Obviously they had to pay him $212 million. But they didn't have to pay any assets to get Paul George. They just had cap space available from their moves over the past couple years, and they just used it on Paul George. They got the blue chip free agent that everybody wanted was Paul George, and they got him. So that is a massive W. The best free agent of the offseason goes to the Philadelphia 76ers. They form a big three, and it is just worth noting to give the front office of the Philadelphia 76ers a lot of credit here. They went 3 years ago. We're in the wake of the massive Ben Simmons meltdown against the Atlanta Hawks. They blow that second round series against a team that they were much better than. Ben Simmons has a meltdown. He announces he's played his last game with Philadelphia. He's holding out from the team. He's not playing at all. And Daryl Morey is able to spin that. They obviously have to give up some assets along with Ben Simmons, but they got James Harden in return for Ben Simmons. And that was a massive win because at least Harden plays basketball. And even when Harden had his meltdown this time last year, right, he's calling Daryl Morey a liar to start the season, and he doesn't want to play with the Sixers anymore. They're still able to recoup some draft capital. Like, the players they got in that James Harden trade roughly a year ago was basically null, right? Like, none of those guys are really going to play a role on the team this upcoming season. But still, they got some extra draft assets. They got off of Harden's contract, whatever, and they knew they were in a spot to, hey, look, we're probably just rolling with Maxey and Embiid for this season, which they did, and ultimately Embiid missed a huge chunk of the season, so they were a lower seed or whatever. But they knew that, like, their real move to be made was going to be this offseason when they had a ton of cap space. And so in total, obviously it wasn't like all trades and whatever, but to go from Ben Simmons to James Harden to Paul George in that spot while developing a guy like Tyrese Maxey, like, the Sixers just crushed it. And then the icing on the cake is a Caleb Martin deal. Like, 4 years, $32 million for a dude that's had incredible playoff moments with the Miami Heat is a steal of a deal. $8 million a year for Caleb Martin is nuts. Reportedly, Martin declined a 5-year, $65 million contract to stay in Miami. So an extra year and basically double the money to stay in Miami is interesting. So we're going to talk more about the Heat in a bit. But to pry him away from Heat and Heat culture, that is not very Heat culture-esque. And that's a guy that is, again, had real playoff moments, presumably might start for the Sixers as well at like that semi-power forward spot along with Paul George. Like, they still have enough size there. So I don't know, man. But Caleb Martin's a really good pickup. And getting Eric Gordon, too. Like, 2 years, $7 million, like a veteran that can shoot the ball, is a one-to-one replacement for that Buddy Hield spot. And Buddy Hield was abysmal for the Sixers last year, besides like one playoff game in which he was really hot. And I think maybe even the last game of the season for the Sixers. But regardless, the Sixers, look, I'm not saying that they're the team to beat out of the East, not even close. That's clearly Boston, and I'm certainly never going to pick the Sixers over my Boston Celtics in the playoffs, because if there's one team that my Celtics own, it is the 76ers. But I have to call a spade a spade. Like, the Sixers got a lot better, and their front office deserves a ton of credit. So they are easily the most improved team from this year to last year. Now let's get negative. Let's talk about the losers of the offseason. And this is actually a pretty nice transition. We were just talking about Caleb Barton declining more money and more years to stay in Miami. Let's talk about the number 5 biggest loser of the offseason, the Miami Heat. They did have some positives, right? They re-signed Bam Adebayo on a 3-year extension, which is actually kind of similar to the Jalen Brunson contract. So we'll talk more about that in a sec. Thomas Bryant returns as well on a 1-year deal. Haywood Highsmith returns on a 2-year deal. Kevin Love returns on a 2-year deal. They sign a 1-year deal for Alec Burks, whatever. But they did lose Caleb Martin, and they also lost DeLon Wright, who was on their rotation during the playoffs as well. And just to give them some credit, the Bam extension was undoubtedly a great move. 3 years, 166 for Bam is a steal. It's basically the same situation as Jalen Brunson. And if he would have waited and made an All-NBA team, he's basically leaving a similar amount of money to Jalen Brunson. Even if he just waits and doesn't make an All-NBA team, he's still in a really good spot with that. He's still making a lot more money than what he would have made than the 166 he got now. But again, there's injury risk involved. He hits free agency sooner. It's all the same reasons as Brunson for the most part. But the issue is that they lost Caleb Martin. That's a huge part of their team. Guy that's been in playoff games, turned down more money. So part of him must have wanted to get out of Miami for whatever reason. So that's not very Heat culture-esque. And then the elephant in the room is that Jimmy Butler has a player option for the season after this upcoming season, right? So basically, if he declines that player option, then he's going to hit unrestricted free agency at this time next year. There's no extension in sight. There's been some weird comments from Jimmy when he was trolling the Celtics, and then Pat Riley called him out or whatever. And then he was courtside at a Sparks game in the WNBA, and he made some comments, kind of joking about him playing on another team. He danced around it or whatever. But there's been some weird signs out of Miami. And just in general, look, Caleb Barton is a loss and whatever. But all these other teams in the East are getting a lot better. We talked about the Sixers getting a lot better. We talked about the Bucks making marginal improvements. The Celtics have re-signed everybody. The Sixers are the clear winner of the offseason. And then Miami, just by comparison, all you did was lose one of your key role players. That's not going to cut it. You need to be making real strides. Even if Miami stayed the same and kept Caleb Barton, I don't think they're a top 4 team in the East. And so it's just really tough when everyone else is getting better and you're staying stagnant and losing role players. You just got to compare it a little bit. I'm wondering what that move is for Miami. They got cute when Dame demanded to be traded for Miami last year, and they waited it out. I don't know if they were trying to drive the price even lower or play hardball with the Blazers, but ultimately the Bucks stepped up, saw the opportunity, figured Dame loved basketball and would still want to play for the Bucks team and have the opportunity to play alongside Giannis, and they went out and they got the deal done. Now, I don't like that move for Milwaukee, but at least they capitalized on an opportunity to get, a top 20-ish player in the NBA in Dame Lillard. The Heat just stood by, and I would have liked it more if they had got Dame Lillard. I think the fit of Dame in Miami made a lot more sense than Milwaukee. But regardless, I wonder what that next move for Miami is going to be. But this was definitely a loss of an offseason for them. Number 4, losers of the offseason, Chicago Bulls. This is just a loser franchise, so I guess you could always put the Bulls in this list perennially. Their big contract extension of the offseason was Patrick Williams on a 5-year, $90 million contract. Fun fact, heard this from Zach Lowe. This is actually more money than what Kevin Durant got in his first max contract extension with the Thunder. I know times have changed in the past decade plus since Durant signed that deal, but that is just hilarious to think of how much the cap has gone up and how much larger these contracts have become. Because Patrick Williams, a guy that you guys probably have never heard of, is now making more money than what Kevin Durant's first extension was for a guy that's proven nothing in the NBA. They also added Chris Duarte, Josh Giddey, Jalen Smith, and they also lost Alex Caruso, DeMar DeRozan, and Andre Drummond. I think the main reason I'm putting the Bulls at number 4 on this list, as much as I kind of defended the Giddey deal and the move to swap Caruso for Giddey, the fact that DeRozan, you knew he was going to hit free agency, and obviously the fact that they got something for him is a W, I guess, just because there was a chance he just outright signed with another team and you didn't even get Duarte in the second-round picks that you were able to recoup. But DeMar DeRozan, there was a sign-and-trade, and out of that transaction, the Spurs are the real winner. The Spurs are the ones that get the pick swap. How? How did the San Antonio Spurs come up on top? And you're the Chicago Bulls. You suck terribly. And you have a valuable player that is going to hit free agency in the near future. And instead of trading DeMar DeRozan this time last year, instead of trading him at the deadline, even if you got barely anything for him, it would have been more than what you ended up getting in this shitty sign-and trade. Like, it's just incompetence. It's incompetence by the team that your big move was re-signing Patrick Williams to a way overpriced contract, and then DeMar DeRozan ends up settling for a sign-and trade, and the real winners of that transaction are the Spurs, not the Bulls, who had DeMar DeRozan on the roster. So, embarrassment of an offseason for the Chicago Bulls, but you guys, if our Bulls fans, are used to that by now. Next losers of the offseason, number 3 on my list, the Golden State Warriors. They made some additions. Let's go through them. They added Kyle Anderson on a 3-year deal. They added Buddy Hield. They added DeAnthony Melton. They did lose Chris Paul. They waived him. Was not worth the money that he was entitled for this season, so that mostly makes sense. They lost Dario Saric, and then, of course, Klay Thompson went out and signed with the Mavericks, or I guess he was a part of a sign-and trade to go to the Mavericks. I don't like the Warriors offseason. I think they got worse. Even with the diminished version of Klay, I think losing Chris Paul, Dario Saric, and Klay Thompson, I think is a better trio than Kyle Anderson, Buddy Hield, and DeAnthony Melton. That's my opinion. But the thing is even if I'm wrong, like even if I'm slightly wrong on that take, like it's not moving the ball forward for the Warriors. They're not getting better enough to actually compete or do something in the Western Conference. Like the ship has sailed. Like with this move, the dynasty's over. And it was just, some of the details came out of the Klay Thompson negotiations and basically the front office decision to pay Draymond first. And they clearly wanted to see what money they could get with other guys before settling and basically offering the same money to Klay, if not more money than what he ended up signing with the Mavericks. But it wasn't what was offered to Klay, it was how it was offered to Klay. And so it's just really embarrassing that team would ruin the relationship with Klay Thompson. But even if he needed like a change of scenery, again, this team is not marginally better. People gas up Kyle Anderson just because he's unathletic, like, oh, that must mean he's like a savant and a genius on defense and such a great playmaker. Like the buddy takes 45 minutes to get up a corner 3 and he shoots it at a terrible clip and he can't move his feet faster than I can. Like there's holes in this guy's game and he's also like just a jerk on the court. I can't stand watching Kyle Anderson. And go ahead, yeah, bring him into the super intelligent high level Warrior system and play him alongside Draymond Green and you got two guys that can't shoot the ball. At this point, Draymond Green is a much better shooter than Kyle Anderson, by the way. So there are going to be real difficulties when those guys play together. So that's my little rant on Kyle Anderson. I still can't stand that guy. Buddy Hield, like I said, was on paper, he's a great 3-point shooter and whatever, and maybe he's the Klay replacement, which is hilarious. But that being said, like, he was terrible last season. Like, he couldn't get in the rotation. Like, there seemed to be, like, some mental stuff going on with his shot and whatever. Like, I know he had one big game, but I don't know. Buddy Hield is just such a meh player. Melton's actually a really good signing for a 1-year deal, and I think it was only worth, like, $13 million. So that's good value, but the dude couldn't stay healthy last year in Philly, so we'll see what he's able to develop into. The best thing I can say about them is that their second unit is, like, nasty defensively now with Melton and Gary Payton and Kyle Anderson. Like, there are a lot of good defenders there, but in general, like, what are we waiting on? Like, the big trade chip out there that we're going to talk about what's left to discuss and what's left to unfold this offseason, on the top of the list of any sort of trade chip is Lauri Markkanen. If the Warriors go out and get Lauri Markkanen, I will eat my words. They will suddenly be a winner of the offseason. But at this point, it's not looking particularly likely. I'd imagine the price on Markkanen is extremely high, but like, do something, like trade all those future picks, trade Moses Moody, trade Jonathan Kuminga, do something to build a team around Steph Curry in the twilight of his career. You can still win a championship with Steph as the best player, but you're only going to be able to say that for a few more years. And obviously you're not like worried about losing Steph. Like he's going to be there forever. But like, God damn it, don't you want to be competitive the last few years of the career? Like just cut bait on the last remaining like 2 timelines shit. Like if you can get something for Kuminga, do it. They didn't even want to start Kuminga last year. Like, you better start him this year. You better. Like, I don't care about if the fit is a little clunky next to Draymond Green. He's one of your, like, 3 best players at this point in time. Like, start the guy. Or move on if you're not going to feel confident starting him. Because it's just embarrassing at this point what they're doing around Steph Curry. They're not contenders. They're not all that close. And they have a real move they need to make. And I think they got worse this offseason. The second biggest loser of the offseason is the Denver Nuggets. And this might be a little harsh just because of what I consider the Nuggets to be, potentially the best team in the NBA. Certainly, in my opinion, was the team to beat coming out of the West last year. They didn't re-sign anybody. They did add Dario Saric on a 2-year, $11 million deal, but they lost KCP, right? Like, the elephant in this room is they lost KCP. He signed 3 for $66 with the Orlando Magic. They also lost Reggie Jackson as part of a trade with the Hornets. Losing a guy that was a starter on not only your championship team, but like the 2020 Lakers championship team as well, and KCP, like, that's just a big loss. I know he obviously can't stay in front of Anthony Edwards. It's not that damning because basically nobody in the NBA can. But besides that, like, KCP was at times your third best offensive option, like a really consistent defender, a really consistent perimeter shooter. And again, a guy that you've proven to win with, like that's a lot to ask of Christian Braun and Peyton Watson, one of those two guys, presumably Brown, to step into the starting lineup now and play real minutes. Like it's such a different role going from like energy guy to every game starter. It's such a big leap. And I just don't know if either one of those guys profiles in that KCP spot. They certainly, neither of them have the outside shooting of what KCP was able to provide. And they could have signed him. They could have signed 3 for 66. It just would have put them at the second apron. And they just would rather have the flexibility of being below the second apron and having the ability to just kind of funnel in those younger guys. And it was already announced, I think they drafted like a big guy with one of their draft picks. It was announced yesterday that he tore his Achilles in the first Summer League game, which is super unexpected. Obviously not the fault of the Nuggets, but a brutal loss nonetheless. It's just hard when, again, OKC got a lot better, and then you guys went out and you lost one of your core starters of your championship team. That's now 2 players of the 2023 championship Nuggets that are now on different teams, and Bruce Brown and KCP. Like, it's a loss. It's a loss, and there's no clear replacement. And I don't think they're going to make like a splash play to replace KCP with somebody else. I don't think there's a trade to be made for the Nuggets. So I think it just is what it is. And now I have real doubts about if they're still going to be my team to beat out of the West heading into next season. But don't worry, Nuggets. The biggest loser of the offseason, bar none, is the Los Angeles Clippers. They re-signed James Harden on a 2-year, $70 million contract extension. They also added a few guys. They added Mo Bamba, Nick Batum, Derek Jones Jr. They also signed Kevin Porter Jr., who had a offseason incident a couple months ago at this point in time, in which he was accused of domestic violence. So that's kind of a bad look for the Clippers as well. But the big loss is Paul George, right? He signed with the Philadelphia 76ers for absolutely nothing. And I just cannot for the life of me wrap my head around the decision to let Paul George walk. I understand they're probably not winning a title, but every move that the Clippers have made over the past several seasons is being all in around the duo of Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. And you punt on Paul George, you lose him for absolutely nothing in the offseason, but you still have all those other guys in place. So it's not like, hey, we just didn't think it was worth it to pay him that much and be at the second apron and do all this stuff. We just wanted to, rebuild and bring in some younger guys. No, like they're still all in, but they're all in without a guy that has the upside of being a top 20 player in the NBA and Paul George. Like, it doesn't make any sense, especially with Ballmer heading into the new arena and the rebrand and everything like that, that now is the time where they want to cheap out. It was announced through Paul George's Podcast P, right? Where he basically detailed, if you believe him, in his version, what transpired with the negotiations. Originally, like the Clippers, like super lowballed Paul George in the season, like saying he had to opt in to his player option, and then like they were gonna extend him for like 2 years, $60 million after that, which is chump change for a guy like Paul George at this point compared to what other guys are making. And then he wanted the 4th year, and the Clippers didn't want to give him the 4th year. And then they're like, okay, at the very least, give me what Kawhi Leonard got, but give me the no trade clause, which I get because look, the no trade clause really tanks the value of certain guys because it gives Paul George all the leverage if he did become unhappy and want to leave the team. But still, like the no trade clause, you would think he's asking for that just so he has the ability to stay with the Clippers, right? Like, and just be locked in. And they didn't want to give him the no trade clause. They didn't want to give him the same money that Kawhi Leonard made, which I get it. Kawhi Leonard's the better player, but Paul George has been more durable than Kawhi Leonard. So you could make the argument that Paul George deserves that money. But bottom line, the Clippers cheaped out, and they somewhat mistreated Paul George, and Clippers fans have a right to be mad at Paul George because, he was a part of like what's going to look like one of the worst trades in NBA history now. All the picks and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander that the Clippers had to give up to bring in Paul George, that looks miserable now. Like, it looks even worse knowing that the one guy you got in that deal just left for nothing in the offseason. Like, that's so embarrassing. I just don't like it from the Clippers perspective. Like, you go all in and you cheap out at the last second. I can't understand for the life of me what Ballmer's doing. And sure, maybe I'm being too hard on them or whatever. But look, whether you like it or not, there was a time in the past 6 months that the Clippers looked like the best team in the NBA. We forget so quickly with how they flamed out in the playoffs and Kawhi Leonard got hurt again. But there was a world in which that Clippers team we just saw competed for a championship. They won like 20 out of like 21 games or something crazy like that in January. They beat the crap out of the Celtics in Boston, one of the most dominant performances of the entire year. So at least if you have the same core, and maybe you do work around the fringes and you still bring in a guy like Derek Jones or, Kevin Porter Jr. if you want to take that swing, whatever. And you can talk yourselves into like, hey, there is a path. It's a very small chance with the injury history of our guys, but there is a chance. And they just let Paul George go. And it's just really embarrassing. Again, they did bring in some other guys, right? Like they brought in Bamba, and the Derek Jones Jr. deal is whatever. And Kevin Porter, look, like if that guy can just play basketball, there's a really good chance that contract of 2 years, $5 million is an absolute steal. it remains to be seen as how you want to be seen publicly, how you want your team to be perceived with that type of allegations going against KPJ. I'm not super buttoned up with the legal situation, so that's all I'll say on that. But there's just no world in which the Clippers are better than what they were. Like, the best version of the Clippers last year is 100 times better than the best version of the Clippers this year, and they lost Paul George for nothing. That's what makes them the biggest loser of the offseason. Now, what's next? That basically covers it, right? We talked about the best winners and losers, and I will just recap my top 5 list in order. Winners first, number 5, I have the Dallas Mavericks. Number 4, the San Antonio Spurs. Number 3, the New York Knicks. Number 2, the Oklahoma City Thunder. And number 1, the Philadelphia 76ers. And the biggest loser of the offseason, number 5, the Miami Heat. Number 4, the Chicago Bulls. Number 3, the Golden State Warriors. Number 2, the Denver Nuggets. And number 1, the Los Angeles Clippers. That's the winners and losers. Now, again, this is July 14th at the time of recording this. A lot can change. There are still a few trade chips out there, but I don't expect anyone to get moved extremely soon. So I did just want to get this podcast out and at least recap free agency. But I will just announce some of the remaining free agents that could be notable if they sign somewhere. The list is pretty slim, but it is guys like Tyus Jones, still waiting to sign with the team, Spencer Dinwiddie, Isaac Okoro, Gary Trent, Precious Achiuwa, who we talked about, Gordon Hayward, Luke Kennard, Lonnie Walker, Markelle Fultz. Those are probably the best free agents remaining, so not a lot of needle movers there. But as far as the trade chips, I think that's where it gets interesting, right? We already mentioned Markkanen. Like, that price is going to be insane for whatever team goes out and gets Lauri Markkanen, because the Jazz shouldn't be in a rush to trade him. But presumably Markkanen's so good that, like, if the Jazz really do want to tank, like, he is the driving force behind that team getting to like 30 or 40 wins. Like, they have that type of potential with Markkanen, where if you remove him from the equation, maybe they're a bottom feeder team and they're drafting Cooper Flagg this time next year. So there is some incentive to move him. But he's nasty. Like, again, he is the perfect Golden State fit because he's 7 feet tall. He can shoot the ball. They finally get that size that Golden State has been missing forever and ever. But you do it in a sort of unconventional way. Like, you still have the floor spacing, and then Draymond's still kind of the anchor on defense. But, like, Markkanen can guard like a Kristaps Porzingis if he really had to for stretches. Like, I don't know. Like, it's just so much creativity you can do with Markkanen on the floor. But some other trade chips are Brandon Ingram. Like, again, people are saying his days are numbered in New Orleans, kind of the positional redundancy with him and Trey Murphy and, of course, Herb Jones as well. Like, there's just a lot of wings there, and Brandon Ingram doesn't make the most sense. They really need a center. Darius Garland might be available now that Mitchell re-signed as well. It is worth noting that Donovan Mitchell re-signed an extension with the Cavs. So after all that talk, it seems like he's finally staying. But does this mean they move on from Garland? You know, Mobley's obviously the long-term fit there. Do they move on from a guy like Jared Allen? And some other potential trade chips are Portland, right, with their big man rotation, Rob Williams and DeAndre Ayton. They have both those guys, and they just drafted a 7'3" guy in Donovan Clingan from UConn in the draft. So that's presumably the future of the center position. I'd expect at least one of Rob Williams and DeAndre Ayton to get moved before the start of the season. Maybe to New Orleans, who knows? And then finally, again, I've still been told by my sources that the Rockets might not be convinced on the long-term fit of Şengün. Maybe he's moved in a potential Brandon Ingram swap. Maybe he's moved somewhere else. But that is worth noting as well. So, long podcast today, I know, but we had a ton to cover. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the winners and losers of the offseason. Let me know if you agree, if you disagree, and leave a comment. Be sure to follow @WordsWithWallace on everything. That includes Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you get your podcasts. @WordsWithWallace on social media as well. Be sure to drop a follow. And on the next podcast, I'll continue to cover Team USA. If there's any other notable news as far as the NBA offseason, I will cover that. Maybe I'll bring on a guest. And then if not, maybe I'll start ranking my players in the offseason. Typical offseason content from this guy. I will try to be very consistent, bringing you guys one podcast a week. And I will talk to you next week. Peace.